Let's talk about a movement in academic ethics in Britain. After the First World War, people really did have their sense of value shattered. And they were trying to rebuild some notion of value, some notion of norms, some conception of right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. The war disrupted things for reasons that I think are somewhat unclear and that I want to raise in this course, but we're really not going to answer, though we'll contemplate possible answers. My own take on the First World War was that it was a series of accidents. Okay, a bunch of accidents added up to a disaster that, due to technology, due to strategies in warfare, due to a variety of other factors, ended up producing immense loss of life. But there really weren't many ideas involved. There weren't many values at stake. Woodrow Wilson tried to say that he was trying to make the world safe for democracy, but it didn't really seem to be about democracy. It didn't really seem to be about monarchy or imperialism or any other sort of thing that people talked about. It seemed to be a series of accidents. And so the real question was, why would you think that this has any implication for the world of ideas at all? Why in particular would you think, oh, all the values I've been taught, everything I believed was a lie? And yet that's the impression people came away from the war with. They ended up thinking everything about the past is wrong. Everything I've been taught is a lie. And so they tried to rebuild on that foundation. Well, let's take a look at how some philosophers and literary figures in Britain did that. Before the war, there was a growing sense of cynicism, as we've seen. It started out with just a few intellectuals, people like Nietzsche, George Bernard Shaw. But there was this sense that in a way, well, maybe it was in spite of, maybe it was because of unprecedented affluence, democracy, respect for rights, relative peace, that actually people began to question traditional values. What happens when life is good? When, hey, there's plenty of money. When there is no real struggle for existence. When there's peace. When actually government is working pretty well. When everybody's rights are respected and so on. What is life like? You wouldn't know. But that's a joke. But no, I mean, partly it's great, right? That's what we all tend to want. We're like, yeah, we want prosperity, we want peace, these are good things. But to some extent that produces, in a certain kind of person anyway, a condition of boredom. You don't have to struggle, you don't have to fight. And so certain people get bored. They start, in fact, there was a dissertation student here back in the 80s who wrote his entire dissertation on boredom. I didn't read it. I figured that would be the most boring thing in the world. But I wasn't on his committee. I didn't have to read it. But I assume some people read it. In any event, yeah, I think it does produce in some people a sense of boredom, but all of that was before the war. After the war, there were a series of reactions. A bitterness, as in the war poets, like Wilfred Owen. A sort of nostalgia, a fear, a sense of decline, as in T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. An attempt to revive tradition, which is what we've seen in Kipling. Kipling's basically trying to take you back to those 19th century values, saying, look, why did we ever start doubting them in the first place? Maybe it was the doubt that got us into trouble and not the values themselves. And then, as we'll see next week, a belief in irrationality arises. Sigmund Freud, who says really everything we think consciously is the reflection of some basically irrational subconscious urge. Or Luigi Pirandello, who we'll look at next week, who also glorifies in the absurd and the irrational. Or artistic movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism that we're going to be talking about soon. Well, in the academy, in philosophy, people didn't embrace irrationality, but they did try to set ethics on a new foundation. And so today I want to look at a couple of instances of this. One person who was writing before the war, and then one who wrote, to some extent before the war, and then his most famous work, perhaps, after the war. Well, they did try to start up ethics in a new form. And they ended up being the people who would train a new set of leaders. The leaders that would take Britain through the interwar years and actually, in some ways, set up the conditions for World War II. Let's start this way. Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, says, the ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of its ruling class. What does he mean? He means, well, the people who are in charge, the bourgeoisie, not only dominate economically, they dominate intellectually. It's their ideas that become the ideas of the age. And there was a plausibility to that thought. You could think, well then, how do you explain yourself, Karl? I mean, after all, you're not serving the interests of the ruling class, so what's up with this? Well, he said, the intellectuals are a different group. They're the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. They're the proletarians, they're the workers, And then there are intellectuals who are a group of the bourgeoisie who actually break away and start identifying their own interests with those of the proletariat. They become something like the voice of the proletariat. And then in Lenin, of course, they become a revolutionary vanguard. But in Marx himself, they just become spokespeople. And so that's how he explains himself, that's how he explains Engels, the rich industrialist. Now, at an earlier time, there was some plausibility to this. This is an image of a French salon, where people of the upper classes, the aristocrats, would get together and discuss intellectual issues. These salons were very popular in Paris and in Vienna, a number of other prominent European cities. Basically, aristocrats would get together and show off how smart they were. These were something like aristocratic book clubs. And they were very popular. People became quite famous for just their contributions to these things, or in some cases just for hosting them. Now, that was the way things worked for a long time. But in the 1920s, we see something fundamentally new. For the first time, the class generating ideas, the intellectuals in society, starts seeing itself primarily and permanently in opposition to the ruling class. Okay, so before this, you might say the intellectuals were typically people who were aristocrats themselves or who worked closely with aristocrats. Leibniz was a diplomat, Locke was a medical doctor, but the doctor, the personal physician of the Earl of Shaftesbury, these were people who were connected at least to people at the very top of their society. In the 1920s, all of a sudden the intellectual class starts doing something different, gives up on its beliefs in, you might say, the dominant ideas of the age, and sees its role as undermining them, as attacking them. Here's a rather different image of the intellectual, standing on a ladder, reading his book nearsightedly. Anyway, Julian Benda, in 1927, wrote a book called The Treason of the Clerics, also sometimes translated The Treason of the Intellectuals, arguing for just this thesis. He saw the intellectual group as treasonous, as destructive to society. This started, he thought, in the 19th century, actually, with figures like Nietzsche, and then grew somewhat early in the 20th century with figures like Shaw, but he sees it in the 20s becoming an epidemic. He says, this group, the clerics, as he puts it, not only sets itself up in opposition to the ruling class, but its ideas are training the leaders to come. And he thinks that raises a deep problem. You might say any society has as one of its main jobs passing itself and its values along to the next generation of people. And at the top, that means not just doing this in a very general way, but also training the next generation of leaders. Now, how do you do that? How do we, for example, train our next generation of leaders? Like this. Yeah, right, we're doing it now. That's one way in which we do it. In Britain, this was done by sending people to certain special schools. Eton, for example, as a prep school, and then to Oxford or Cambridge. That was sort of the way you gained power and became a member of the aristocracy and perhaps a political leader. In the United States, it's not nearly that. I say it's not nearly that, although where have our presidents gone to school? Actually, Harvard, Yale, Harvard. But hey, we tend to think, no, it's not quite that restricted. And indeed, there are many, many different universities you can attend in the United States and at least become a prominent person in society. So, nevertheless, there is that way, right? There's a method we have for training the next generation of leaders. What if the people who are in charge of that don't, in fact, have the values of the society that they're trying to pass on, but are seeking to undermine them? What if the people in charge, what if the professors, for example, are not saying, here, I'm going to teach you the values of our civilization so you can take over leadership of it, but instead are saying, I want to undermine the values of our civilization so that you can, what? Lead it in a very, very different way and fundamentally change it. In any case, what happens, Benda says, is this creates a group of leaders, intellectual leaders, and then ultimately economic, political leaders, who no longer identify with their society or with its interests, who start being a force to actually work against their own society rather than perpetuating it. Here's how he expressed this. Humanity did evil for 2,000 years, but honored good. This contradiction was an honor to the human species and formed the rift whereby civilization slipped into the world. Basically, Benda says, look, people are often hypocrites. They espouse one set of values, they don't really live up to it. But you know what? That's not entirely a bad thing. It's hypocrisy, yes. It's an individual failing. But at least they honor those values, right? That's better than not honoring them at all. So we may have these values, we don't quite live up to them, but at least we uphold those and try to actually uphold those values. And so often people will say, yeah, hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. But at least some homage is getting paid to virtue. Without that happening, Ben is worried that, in fact, there won't be any homage paid to virtue at all. So he sees all of this is changing around the beginning of the 20th century. There starts being a denunciation of hypocrisy, a promotion of authenticity as the main moral value. We've seen that in Nietzsche. We're going to see it in a bunch of other figures as well throughout the 20th century. So he sees intellectuals as abandoning traditional ideals and really all universal values, period. Universal values of morality, of politics, but also really ultimately of truth itself. So, let's think back to Nietzsche. Remember, at the very end of our discussion of Nietzsche, we said, what positive do we get out of this? Well, all he really gives us is this notion of authenticity. He says, this is what my conscience says, you are to become the person you are. And so that's the only real value left. Authenticity, not being a hypocrite, fully embracing the person you are. Now, how is that as a moral value? Is that a good moral value? A bad moral value? Does it have dangers? Does it have strengths? Suppose we say, yeah, that's to be the only value. You are to become the person you are. Embrace your inner self.
You might not improve from that?
Well, good. What about self-improvement? How do I get better? I think I should embrace the person I am. This reminds me actually of the end of a Simpson episode where Homer says, that's what I've been saying. We're all fine just the way we are. So yes, that's a danger. We might say, yeah, I just embrace who I am. I'm this guy who, yeah, has this tendency to eat too much and drink too much and blah, 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 blah. And hey, that's just who I am. I embrace it, you know. And so, yeah, it could undermine any attempted self-improvement. Do you see other strengths or weaknesses in this? Yeah.
Could you interpret it in a more positive way as in you're trying to reach the highest form of your potential as you as a person and not necessarily just like a single state?
Good. You might think, wait a minute. Don't think about this as in terms of being and embracing the person you are like right now, right this minute. Think of it in terms of your potential. In fact, sometimes people will use this in a religious context, but what they mean is not, so you're fine just the way you are. They mean you are really deep inside, and fill in the blank with a particular religion, a child of God maybe. Or you are really, the Buddha nature embodied. Or you are really this or that or the other thing. And then they're not saying, yeah, so you're fine the way you are. They really mean to be saying there is some potential, there's some inner nature that is being covered over, and embrace and find that inner nature. Yes?
Becoming the person that you are, it supports individuality. And the more individuality, the more diverse individuality allows for more creativity. So if we have more people who are different, then we can have more points of view and positive.
Okay, good. There's a strength of this. Instead of saying, here's the ideal, become like that, we can say, find your inner nature, your real character, your real potential, and be that. And that might be different for different people. And so you could take that in a relativist direction, but you could also just say, hey, this is good. We're now going to have a diversity of strengths. Not everybody has to fit this one mold. You might see this as an alternative, in other words, to a kind of conformity that says, here's the ideal person, everybody has to be like that. For example, if we take Kipling's poem If and say, there's the ideal, everybody has to be like that, this response would be to say, well, maybe some people, that really is their true inner nature, but maybe for some it's not. We don't all have to fit the same mold and exhibit the same virtues. Yeah?
There has to be like a balance, like you said, I think it was last lecture, like too much diversity isn't good. There has to be like a nature, like we have to have some like central values.
Ooh, good, yes. We might think, yes, diversity is good. So if you want to be the sort of person who excels at gentleness and generosity, that's great. If somebody else wants to excel at courage and quick decision making and so on, that's great. But what if I am somebody who loves to kill? My inner nature is murder. then you might say, I don't want you to be who you really are, right? Maybe then, like Dexter, we want to say, no, we want to really shape and demo who you really are, and try to either cover that up or direct it toward good or something. Yeah.
It seems like if in 20 years, if you look at like what you have done over the past, and you realize that everything else led up to who you are now, you will only become that one person in 20 years, and everything that leads up to it will ultimately lead to that one like end result.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I've sometimes wondered about that. Because sometimes you look back and you see everything that's happened in your life as leading up to the present, as if it was somehow fated that you become this person, right? And there is some point to that, because after all, I do think, actually, the older you get, in a strange way, the more unified your life gets. The more the various strands of it tie together. And so the more it feels that way. And yet, that can be misleading, because at certain points you actually make decisions, right? And you might think, ooh, shall I go this way or go that way? Which is truly the person I am? It might depend on your choice, right? Maybe you could become that person and could become that person. And either path you take this path, say, you say, oh, see, it all really led up to this. Well, yes, it did as a matter of fact because of the choices you made, but maybe it didn't have to. Maybe you could have become that person instead. And so there's a strength and a weakness that I'm hearing in what you're saying. The strength of seeing the unity in your life, seeing your life as tied together and sort of leading to a certain you. But there's also a danger in that it can make you forget that sometimes you really are making choices, and what you have been up to this point doesn't really determine what you become next. You have different futures you can embrace. This is a theme we're going to talk about a lot later when we get to Borges and we see this possibility of different kinds of futures. Yes?
Wouldn't your predisposition to make a certain type of choice pretty much directly correlate to you becoming that type of person? Like if you have the ability to go left or right and you have the predisposition to go to the right, and then whenever you go that direction, it ends up shaping your character further. It's more from where you already were.
Well, that's true. So it's probably true that we have characters that give us certain tendencies to make certain kinds of choices. So if somebody comes up to me and says, listen, you could have been an engineer, I'd be tempted to say, well, maybe, but I doubt it. Right? I tend to be the sort of person who wouldn't really be happy making those kinds of decisions. Now maybe I'm wrong about that. I went to a small college that didn't have any engineering program. Maybe if I had taken engineering, I would have loved it. But my suspicion is, having a daughter who went through an engineering program here, I sort of thought, no, I don't think I would have. I don't think I would have liked it. Even though I love math and I love science, engineering physics is so different from the physics I studied. I thought I could tutor my daughter in engineering physics. But, oh yeah, I know physics. I basically minored in physics, no problem. But then it's like, you know what the difference is between engineering physics and the theoretical physics I studied? Like the world, friction, stuff like that. I mean, wait, there's friction in your world? There's no friction in the theoretical physics world. So it's like, I'm used to dealing with point masses in an idealized universe where, I don't know what to do with like actual boxes that have friction. They're pulling them along. But anyway, yeah, see. So get back to the point, man. So there are certain places where I agree. The tendencies tend to push you in a certain direction. On the other hand, there are times where I think there really are things where the tendencies kind of balance out. You really could go this way, you really could go that way. And then it's not so easy to say. You really do shape yourself by making it. So anyway, I think you're right in the sense that what might seem a vast range of choices, given your personality, is probably a much more narrow range. But within that narrow range, there's still probably some decisions to be made. Yeah?
I kind of think that quote, like, by itself right there is false. Because, like, I honestly believe that time changes people throughout your time. You're different types of a person. So you can't become the person you currently are because you're always going to change.
That's an interesting point. If you take this literally enough and forget her point about potential and just say, the person I am right now, you could say, you're to become the person you are.
I am.
Done and done, right? I'm it, so there you go. From that point of view, this isn't much of a command, right? So in a certain sense, you might say, but tomorrow I'll be a different person. Oh, well, you're to become the person you will be? I mean, yeah, it gets weird. So unless we think of it in terms of potential or some true inner nature or something like that, it seems like, wait, this is just trivial. It's just kind of like, be who you are. Yes, I'm Dan Bonneback. Be it right now. I guess I fulfilled my ethical obligations. And so it kind of seems dumb from that point of view. So I think you're right. Either it's trivial, or it seems wrong, or we have to have some theory about what your real inner nature is. And that's something that Nietzsche, well, at a certain stage of his thought doesn't give us. Later he says, ooh, it's power. You want power? Yeah, I want power. You want power? I would like to control you. Yeah, I will. Yeah. So anyway, the Nazis loved this, right? The Nazis thought this was great. Now, I'm not accusing Nietzsche of being a Nazi, but you can see why a Nazi would love this. Yeah, my nature is to dominate others. I should be who I am, the blonde beast who comes roaring over the plains in search of prey. So you can see how, this basically says, yeah, you think your role is to be a dominant Aryan master? Jawohl. Then it's like, yeah, be that. And so you can see why this could be taken in a certain direction where it seems actually really appalling. In any event, I want to look at a group that certainly does not pursue that avenue, but nevertheless sees traditional morality as essentially corrupted and tries to set it on a different foundation. It's a group that's often known as the Bloomsbury group. It was centered around Cambridge University, and here's a picture of some of the key members. These people were hedonistic, that is to say, they cared about pleasure and leading a pleasant life. They tended, however, to be quite retiring. They tended to just sit in their own gardens here. In fact, most of the pictures of them as groups, you just see them hanging out in somebody's backyard. They seem to just spend a lot of time drinking lemonade and chatting. They had a very strong conception of the private versus the public, and they favored the private instead of the public. Overall, John Maynard Keynes is an exception. Keynes was a member of this group, and he was a prominent economist. He was really the only one, however, who got involved in any public life. They were devoted to introspection, to developing friendships, and they were deeply antagonistic to traditional values. So what I want to do is look at this group, try to figure out what their values really were and what they were trying to substitute for traditional values. Here are some images of them. That's Lytton Strachey on the right and some of his friends on the left. They took their philosophy from the work of G.E. Moore, who was at Cambridge. He was a colleague of Bertrand Russell's and Ludwig Wittgenstein. In fact, Russell and Moore were Wittgenstein's dissertation directors. He was a good friend with this group. The group contained novelist M Forster, Lytton Strachey, Leonard and Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, and a variety of others. And Moore became the philosophical guru of this group. Now, he did this really long before the group itself formed. He wrote a book in 1903 called Principia Ethica, Principles of Ethics. And he wrote this: the fundamental question of ethics is the question, what things are goods or ends in themselves? What is good in and of itself? Okay? Most good things are really good for some other things. They're good for something. But some things are really the ultimate ends of action. We don't just do them because they get us something else. We might pursue one thing for another thing, and that for the sake of this, but eventually you get to something we just pursue for its own sake. So he says the basic question is really, what is that? Philosophers, in fact, ever since Aristotle, have distinguished instrumental goods, things that are good for the sake of something else, from intrinsic goods, things that are good in themselves. So, what are some instrumental goods? Things that are good for the sake of other things. Computers. Yeah, a computer is something that's good because of what it can do for you, right? Because it can actually word process, because it can show you the world by way of the World Wide Web, for a variety of other things it can do, because it can calculate, solve problems, and so on. So it's an instrumental good. What are some other instrumental goods?
Money.
Money, good.
Yes.
Yeah, the father of a friend of mine in college said, I don't care about money, I just care about the things money can buy. And what he was saying really is, yeah, money is a purely instrumental good. At least for most of us, right? There might be people who just pursue money for the sake of money. But ordinarily, it's an instrumental good. Some other instrumental goods. Yeah.
College classes.
College classes, food. Yeah, you could value those for themselves, but you could also value them instrumentally. In fact, when you think of it that way, these are really overlapping categories. They are not things that are just this or that and never the twain shall meet. Because somebody might think of food as purely an instrumental good, They eat to live. Other people might live to eat. And they see food as really good in itself. In fact, one time somebody said to me, name something quick that is just good in and of itself. And I said, a Southside shake. Okay, it's my favorite thing in the world. This shows how low my tastes are. Anyway, this is a kid I went to kindergarten with, operates this ice cream place in Pittsburgh. It was his dad operated it when we were kids. And they have something called a Southside shake, or in Pittsburghese, Southside shake. Okay, it is a shake, any flavor you want, topped by an ice cream sundae, any flavor you want. So what I get is chocolate milkshake, topped with like vanilla ice cream, and then peanut butter sauce poured over. It's like 1,000 calories, it's terrible for you, it's good I don't live nearby. But anyway, it's awesome. And is it really just an instrument for something else? I don't know. It's like an experience that is nearly religious. So anyway, that's something that, you know, is food, right? And we might say the same thing for all sorts of other things. You could value them like learning, knowledge, taking a course for its own sake, or you might be doing it instrumentally. You might say, well, I have to do this to complete my degree plan, to get my degree, blah, blah, blah. I'm doing it instrumentally. Or you might just say, hey, I'm just doing it because I think it's really cool. Yeah.
Emergency services and medical facilities?
Ah, good, emergency services, medical facilities. An ambulance, for example. That's an instrumental good. It's not like people think, hey, you know what? We've solved the problem of disease and illness and accidents and so on. Just nothing bad ever happens to everybody. We all live forever. Somebody says, yeah, but I just love ambulances. Let's just build a bunch of them. Right? No, it's because of what they do for people. The same thing is true of surgeries. Would we do surgery except as an instrument toward health? Or just like, hey, I just feel like cutting somebody up today. No, it's not something we value for its own sake. It's valued instrumentally. Yeah.
Can something unpleasant be an intrinsic good?
Yeah, well, unpleasant be an intrinsic good. What would be an example of something like that? Might be unpleasant, but nevertheless it's good for its own sake. Work might be, yeah, work might be unpleasant, but nevertheless, it might be good for just the end result that it produces, but maybe a certain kind of work is actually good for its own sake, even though it's unpleasant. I mean, what would be an example of that?
Wait, what was the question?
Sorry?
What was the question?
What was the question? Well, yeah, something that's unpleasant, but nevertheless good for its own sake. Exercise? Yeah, I was thinking maybe exercise, maybe study. It might be an unpleasant thing, and maybe it's just that it's a way of getting to that end result, and the end result is a value.
Going to the doctor?
But you could think the process, going to the, no, nobody goes to the doctor just because.
Could it be the process of actually working and doing something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's something about the process. Anyway, I'm not sure. I know some people who think, wait, it's the process that I care about. The process is valuable in and of itself. And you'd have to think something like that to believe in the possibility. Yeah?
Making mistakes, you're getting in trouble and learning from it.
Oh yes, making mistakes, getting into trouble. There's a Forbes magazine I kept around for a long time because the cover story was failure, why it's so damn good for you. Okay, and to some extent it was kind of like, yeah, you don't know how good you are, you don't know how to improve until you fail and actually figure out how to get better. And so it was partly for the sake of getting better, but partly the argument was, look, this builds character and builds a kind of character that you need. So in that sense it's good for its own sake. What are some things that really are good in themselves, good for their own sakes? Not just as an instrument to something else, but you say that's something that's just valuable by itself. Yeah.
Would death be one good in themselves?
Death?
Yeah, because I mean, because you know we're limited in time, so I mean, like, you gotta progress, you gotta be quick. With
Oh, the
what you-
pressure of death?
Yeah, the pressure.
Wow. Death. I don't think of death as a good thing, but admittedly, it depends what your theory of death is. So, yeah, you should talk to somebody about that. Yeah.
Something like a cat or a dog, they don't really do anything for you. They just.
Good. Yes, I've got. Have I told you how many cats I have? I have a lot. Yeah, I have 25 cats, and they aren't good for anything. Okay? I treat them as goods in themselves. I mean, why does anybody have a pet? I mean, sometimes you're on a farm and hey, you need a pet. You need the cats to keep away the rats, or you need a dog to keep away the wolves. But in any event, for most of us, a pet is just this thing that you value in itself. Exactly. It's really good for nothing. Yeah.
Music?
Music seems to be something that's good for its own sake. It's something we like just because we like it, right? It's not that we like it for something. Yeah.
But if music and touch provide joy, aren't they spiritual goods?
Ah, so you might say, well, maybe they're instruments toward joy or pleasure or something like that. So things like joy and pleasure would be great candidates for goods in themselves. Yeah.
Do you actually remember all of your cat's name?
Of course I do. Of course I do. I mean, well, look, there are 25 of them. It's kind of like saying, wow, you're a first grade teacher and you have 25 students? Like, can you remember 25 people's names? Well, yeah. That's not that weird. I mean, if I'm in a philosophy seminar, I don't remember all of your names because there are 100 of you. But if it was a class of 25, I'd know your names. Good. Teddy Roosevelt was crazier than I was. He had more cats than I did. Good. Okay. Well, anyway, Aristotle says, ultimately it's happiness. He gives a traditional philosophical answer. It is happiness, or in his terms in Greek, eudaimonia, which really means something broader than our purely subjective sense of feeling good. He means living well, flourishing, thriving. That's what's ultimately good. So what is it that really all of our activities are directed at? Aristotle would say happiness, living well, flourishing, thriving. That's what's ultimately good. There's a traditional Christian answer. The Westminster Confession and the Catechism puts it this way: to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Aristotle's is sort of self-contained. It is something where I am to live well, to thrive myself. Think of a plant thriving and blooming. Here there's something outer directed about it, to glorify God and enjoy God forever. So there's something about a relationship and a relationship to another being built into this one. This is G.E. Moore's. Personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest and by far the greatest goods we can imagine. So for him, there are two fundamental goods that are the things toward which all human action is directed. They are the things that really are ultimately of value in themselves. What are they? Personal affections, friendship, human relationships, in other words, and aesthetic enjoyments, the appreciation of beauty. So what's it all ultimately about? Being friends, love, all sorts of aspects of human relationships that are valuable, and then the appreciation of beauty. So he goes on, yes, by far the most valuable things we know or can imagine are certain states of consciousness. You might think of friendship as outside, right, as involving another person. But he says, well, I mean personal affections. I mean the feeling of friendship, the feeling of love, not the actual loving. And so it's all really states of consciousness. That feeling of friendship or love that I have, that feeling of the appreciation of beauty, that's what's valuable, okay? The pleasures of human intercourse, and he just means interaction, get your eyes out of the gutter, and enjoying beautiful objects. That friend in college whose father said the thing about money, he got his talking to when they were on a road trip and traveling through Intercourse, Pennsylvania, which is a town in Amish country. Like, oh, that reminds us, Jimmy. Anyway, so he says that's the ultimate moral truth. It is only for the sake of these things, in order that as much of them as possible may at some time exist, that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty. So everything is justified only to the extent that it leads to those states of consciousness, personal affections, or the appreciation of beauty. That's what it's all ultimately about. So everything is valuable only to the extent that it leads toward that appreciation of beauty, or toward that feeling of friendship or love, or some other kind of personal connection. So, well, blah, 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 it goes on and on. What might be left out of that picture? We've talked about various things we might value. Can we express those in these terms? Feelings of personal affection and appreciation of beauty. What might be left out? Food. Food? Yeah. I mean, it depends maybe what we mean by aesthetic enjoyment. Does that include, wow, that tastes good?
Yes.
Yeah.
If it does, then maybe we've got food covered. Although, there are foods you eat not because they taste good. I mean, I used to eat I had this sort of crazy period of being a health Nazi. And I used to eat these things that the rest of my family called roof shingles. They were these rye crackers that are hard as bricks. And I still actually sort of like them. But I gotta admit, I wasn't really eating them for their taste. I thought they were healthy. Okay, there are people I know who eat rice crackers. I can't imagine that they do it for aesthetic enjoyment. So, anyway, I don't know. Things might be left out like that. Yeah.
When you say personal affections, do you mean inner relationships or friendships only? Are you also referring to personal affections to maybe passions, as in if you have a dream for something or for progress?
Good question. They mean friendship. They mean within a personal relationship. But you're right. You might say, here's something else you might want to add. Devotion to a dream, an ideal, that type of thing. Where does that fit in? Unless it's an ideal of beauty and the arts, or unless it's an ideal of love and friendship, they don't know where to put it. Suppose you think, I want to make the world a healthier place. What's that? That's hard to analyze in these terms, right? Or I think people are dying, I want to stop them from dying. Going to Africa to try to treat certain diseases and blah, blah, blah. I don't know how to fit that into this picture. So we're going to see, actually in the work of M Forster here, how this becomes very quickly a different kind of picture. Forster is a well-known novelist. He wrote Where Angels Fear to Tread, A Room with a View, Howard's End, and A Passage to India. The last is the one that he wrote after the First World War. And so he's very well known. Many of these have been made into movies just within the past 10 or 20 years. And he was, within this circle, very influential. There he is. He was an intense kind of guy. And the particular thing I asked you to read was something called What I Believe, from his book, 2 Cheers for Democracy. He starts by saying, I don't believe in belief, which is a rather startling statement. There he is at home, by the way, in his study. But yes, what the Bloomsbury group in general, including Forster, tried to do was replace the morality they found around them with Moore's alternative. And that led to them to oppose a number of things. They opposed faith, because after all, personal affections and the appreciation of beauty, religion didn't have anything to do with that, so they thought faith was ridiculous. And not just faith in God, but all sorts of faith, really. They thought patriotism was ridiculous, and they thought traditional moral ideals, traditional conceptions of virtue were ridiculous. So we're going to see in particular how they thought that. A lot of people think of morality in terms of virtues, in terms of good character traits. And in fact, you might say, look, what kind of person do you want to be? Imagine that you have died and that your friends and family have gathered to pay tributes to you. What kinds of things do you want them to say about you? Well, you don't have to answer, but just think about that for a moment. What kind of vision, what kind of person would you really like to be? What's that moral ideal that you would want people to say, yeah, you were like that? Now, Eliot's answer, we sort of have an idea, right? Somebody who exhibited self-control, who gave, who was merciful. Those are the ideals he upholds at the end of the wasteland. A 19th century answer that was very influential was Walter Pater's. To burn with a hard gem-like flame. To be intense, to live intensely. To sort of grasp every moment and live it to the fullest. Okay, so to be devoted thoroughly and completely to some ideal and to strive for it as hard as you can. That was a 19th century conception. Here's a fairly typical Christian answer. To exhibit faith, hope, and charity. To be strongly committed to your beliefs, to act on them, to seek to improve yourself and the world, and to put others, and including your country, but also your God, ahead of yourself. All of those become targets of the Bloomsbury group. All of those end up being rejected. And maybe the person who does this most explicitly is Lytton Strachey, who in Eminent Victorians in 1918 mocks the 19th century ideal and the Christian ideal. Cyril Connolly describes it as the first book of the 20s. He struck a note of ridicule which the whole war-weary generation wanted to hear. Rudyard Kipling said it was downright wicked in its heart. Why? Well, here is Strachey. He's the guy with the long beard. They're together with friends and family. And there he is with another friend. And yet with another friend. Oh, and some birds on the... kind of creepy. Anyway, So, yes, they mocked people who devoted their lives to educating or helping others. Here are some of the targets in this book, Eminent Victorians. Cardinal Manning. He was famous for his rule of faith sermon. He converted from the Anglican Church to Catholicism. Here's another target, Thomas Arnold. He was actually the father of Matthew Arnold, the famous poet. He was headmaster of Rugby School, which was an elite British private school, and also professor of modern history at Oxford. Another chapter mocks General Gordon. He led campaigns in China and Africa for the British Army. He put down the Taiping Rebellion in China. He worked to stamp out slavery in the Sudan. And he defended Khartoum against a Muslim siege for a year. He died defending the city when the British troops were only about 2 weeks out from relieving the siege. And finally, Florence Nightingale, who founded the first school of nursing. Now, to give you an idea of how they were mocked, here is the beginning of the chapter on Florence Nightingale. Everyone knows the popular conception of Florence Nightingale, the saintly, self-sacrificing woman, the delicate maiden of high degree who threw aside the pleasures of a life of ease to succor the afflicted, the lady with the lamp, gliding through the horrors of the hospital at Scutari, and consecrating with the radiance of her goodness the dying soldier's couch. The vision is familiar to all. But the truth was different. The Miss Nightingale of fact was not as facile fancy painted her. She worked in another fashion. And toward another end, she moved under the stress of an impetus which finds no place in the popular imagination. A demon possessed her. Now, demons, whatever else they may be, are full of interest. And so it happens that the real Miss Nightingale had more that was interesting than the legendary one. There was also less that was agreeable. And so Florence Nightingale, was she trying to help wounded soldiers? No, she was following this demon, this vision of power. Yeah, I will be the one who is known as the mother of nursing. Yeah. Or, Thomas Arnold, this historian who, runs a school to educate British youth. Yes, he is somebody who just wants young boys to be under his control and command. And so on and so forth, right? All of these people who seem to be following noble ideals, no. They're really doing it for utterly self-serving, cynical reasons. Well, Forster, let's go back to him. He says, I don't believe in belief. Why? Well, beliefs give people something to live for, something to die for, but also something to kill for. And so he sees belief, faith, whatever it's in, as actually a danger to the things he cares about, to human relationships, to the appreciation of beauty, to civilization. He says, faith, to my mind, is a stiffening process. A sort of mental starch which ought to be applied as sparingly as possible. I dislike this stuff. I do not believe in it for its own sake at all. And he complains about living in an age of faith. We've characterized the 19th century as an age of faith that begins to fade at the 20th century into an age of doubt, but it hasn't quite faded yet, according to him. He says, I have, however, to live in an age of faith. The sort of epoch I used to hear praised when I was a boy. It's extremely unpleasant, really. It's bloody in every sense of the word. And I have to keep my end up in it. Where do I stop? Now, what does he mean, I have to keep my end up in it? Partly means I have to play my role, I have to do my thing. But also, you're going to see all sorts of kind of slightly covert homosexual imagery in this. Most of the people in the Bloomsbury group were gay. That was not true of Keynes, it was not true of G. Moore himself, but lots of these guys were. And there's a lot of, in fact, some of them aren't very hidden about it at all. Forster's sort of hidden, but that's kind of a gay joke. Okay, and we'll see other examples of that. So, yeah, here's Keynes. He's actually like talking to people and getting involved in public life. But the rest of the group doesn't really do it. So what should we do in response to the conditions of the world? He says, I look the other way until fate strikes me. Whether this is due to courage or cowardice, in my own case, I cannot be sure. But I know that if men had not looked the other way in the past, nothing of any value would survive. So the idea is, look, a lot of bad stuff goes on in the world. Forget about it. Ignore it. Pretend it's not there. It's not entirely bad advice here. He's saying those Victorians went out and tried to change the world and improve the world. Screw it. The best you can do is actually try to, as Eliot puts it at the end of The Wasteland, set your own lands in order. Just try to live your own life and preserve civilization yourself. Don't worry about the rest of it. The entire group was strongly committed to pacifism, and he rejects violence. He says, look, the absence of violence is sometimes called decadence, but I call it civilization. It's the chief justification for the human experiment. Here's Strachey again, in his backyard. Strachey actually went to prison for refusing to participate in the draft during the First World War. He was put on trial very publicly, And the prosecuting attorney said at one point this, "Tell me, Mr. Strachey, what would you do if you saw a German soldier attempting to rape your sister?" His answer was, "I should try to come between them." Okay, the entire courtroom broke out laughing. He was perhaps, of all the people in the group, the one who was sort of most flamboyantly gay and made no attempt to hide it. So anyway, this was, well, yes, it's sort of gross. I mean that particular image, I don't think about it too hard. It's funny, and then the more you think about it, the worse it gets. But anyway. Yes, here's the most famous quip from Forster connected to this. "I hate the idea of causes, and if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country." Okay, what are the fundamental values? Friendship and beauty. Okay, so friendship, that's the highest ideal. Betraying my friend? No, that would be the worst possible thing to do. I would, of course, betray my country before betraying my friend. Now, this group itself was not in any way undermining the state itself. But interestingly, many of their students did become spies for the Soviet Union. People like Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, Leo Long, they all studied with members of the Bloomsbury group and became very famous spies later during the 1930s, working closely with Stalin. Now, the group itself didn't. I mean, I'm not accusing any of them of treason in that literal sense. But their students sort of taught this, ended up doing this. In any case, what does Forster put in place of traditional morality? Well, a morality of tolerance, of personal relationships, of character, of being plucky, being sensitive, seeking knowledge, and so on. He believes in an aristocracy of the plucky. And I want to close with just one thought. He values individualism. He sees democracy as promoting it, hence the 2 cheers for democracy. But here's a way of trying to understand how his value scheme connects to those of Aristotle and others who have a sort of traditional view, and then to Kipling's. His is highly individual, but it's also subjective. It's purely a question of certain states of consciousness being valuable. A more traditional view says, no, it's something objective. It's really you're flourishing, and that's not just something that's feeling like you're flourishing, it's really doing it, really thriving. And then there's Kipling's collective idea. It's really the pack's flourishing for Kipling that matters. That's not to say the pack's flourishing is independent of the individual wolf's flourishing. Of course, it's connected. But it matters whether the pack in the long run flourishes. Those are 3 basically different perspectives, and we're going to see manifestations of them again and again.